A city can disappear in many ways. It can be abandoned slowly, its streets emptied by drought, war, hunger, or the shifting course of a river. It can be buried beneath sand until even its name becomes a sound without a place. It can be conquered, renamed, rebuilt, and forgotten beneath another people's walls. But the ancient Sumerian texts describe something more haunting. They speak of a city that stood at the edge of the world before the Great Flood. Not merely a city of mud brick and temples, but a place where kingship still touched myth, where human history had not yet fully separated from divine memory. Its name was Shuruppak, and in the Sumerian imagination, Shuruppak was not simply destroyed. It became the last breath of a world that no longer exists. What kind of city receives the final kings before the flood? Why would scribes, writing centuries after the supposed catastrophe, preserve the name of this place with such solemn weight? And why does the story not begin with panic, but with a list of cities, a list of kings, a list of reigns so impossibly long that they seem to belong not to history, but to dream? The Sumerian king list is one of the strangest documents from ancient Mesopotamia. On the surface, it appears political. It records cities where kingship was said to have ruled, one after another. It moves through dynasties, names, reigns, and transfers of power. It gives the impression of order. Kingship descends, kings reign, cities rise, cities fall. Yet buried inside this formal record is a sentence that feels like a crack opening beneath the entire ancient world. Then the flood swept over. No long explanation, no detailed description of waves climbing over temple walls, no account of mothers crying in rooftops, priests carrying statues, or animals fleeing through reed marshes. Just a sudden dividing line. There was a world, then there was water. Then kingship had to begin again. This is the first mystery. The text does not treat the flood as a small disaster. It treats it as a boundary between ages. Everything before it belongs to a strange, magnified time, where kings rule for tens of thousands of years and cities seem closer to the gods than to ordinary human settlement. Everything after it becomes more recognizable, still legendary, but slowly approaching the scale of human history. So what was Shuruppak? Ancient texts describe it as the last city to hold kingship before the flood. Archaeologists know Shuruppak was a real city, located at the site now called Tel Farah in southern Iraq. It stood in the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, the land shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where mud became architecture, reeds became boats, and clay became memory. This region was never still. Rivers changed their paths. Floods came and went. Fields bloomed, then failed. Cities depended on canals, labor, grain storage, temple administration, and the ability to organize thousands of lives around water. In Mesopotamia, water was never just landscape. It was blessing and threat. It made civilization possible, and it could erase civilization in a single season. Imagine Shuruppak in the 3rd millennium BCE, not as a silent ruin, but as a living city. Mud brick walls warming under the sun, narrow streets marked by footprints, cart tracks, and animal dung, scribes pressing reeds into wet clay, workers hauling baskets of earth, Priests entering temple precincts where the smell of offerings mixed with dust and smoke. Traders arriving with timber, stone, metals, and stories from places beyond the flat horizon. At night, the city would not have been dark in the way a desert ruin is dark now. Lamps would have flickered in courtyards. Families would have gathered near walls still holding the heat of the day. Above them, the sky would have appeared immense, filled with stars that seemed less like distant objects than messages. What if the people of Shuruppak believed they were living near the end of an age? The ancient texts do not say that ordinary citizens knew disaster was coming. They do not describe daily life in the final hours. They do not give us the diary of a frightened scribe. What they preserve is stranger, the memory of kingship concentrating in one last city, followed by cosmic interruption. In the Sumerian king list, Shuruppak receives kingship after earlier cities have held it. The names are not random. They create a sacred geography of pre-flood power. Kingship begins in Eridu, then moves from city to city until it reaches Shuruppak. There, the final ruler before the flood, appears Obara Tutu. Historians do not treat these enormous reign lengths as literal political chronology. They are usually understood as mythic, ideological, or symbolic. The list was likely shaped by later scribes who wanted to present kingship as a single divine institution moving through selected cities. In that sense, it was not a neutral record. It was a statement about legitimacy. It told readers that power had an origin, a movement, and a sacred order, but that only deepens the mystery. If the list served political or religious purposes, why include the flood at all? Why break the chain of kingship with a catastrophe so absolute that it divides time itself? The answer may lie in how ancient Mesopotamians understood civilization. For them, cities were not accidents. A city was not merely a place where people lived close together. A true city had temples, rituals, divine patrons, scribes, offerings, canals, storehouses, and cosmic meaning. To build a city was to create order against the surrounding chaos, and nothing represented chaos more powerfully than uncontrolled water. The Sumerian word world was filled with waters. There were sweet subterranean waters associated with wisdom and creation. There were rivers that nourished the fields. There were marshes full of life, birds, reeds, fish, and mystery. But there were also overwhelming waters, floodwaters, destructive waters that could undo human planning. To say that the flood swept over was not simply to say that it rained too much. It was to say that order collapsed. It was to say that the boundary between the human world and primeval chaos had failed. Archaeology gives us a different kind of evidence. It does not confirm the Sumerian king list as literal history. It does not prove a single world-destroying flood that erased every city in Mesopotamia at once. Excavations in southern Mesopotamia have found flood deposits at some ancient sites, but these layers vary by location and date. That matters. It suggests real flood events occurred, perhaps severe local or regional disasters, but not necessarily one universal event exactly as later tradition remembered it. Yet archaeology also shows why flood memory could become sacred memory. In a flat river plain, a major flood is not just bad weather. It can tear through fields, contaminate stores, drown animals, collapse walls, destroy canals, and turn the known world into water. For a society whose survival depended on irrigation and grain, such a disaster could feel like divine judgment or cosmic reset. Modern interpretation often sees the flood stories as mythic transformations of real environmental experiences, not invented from nothing, but shaped by trauma, ritual, theology, and political memory. A devastating flood could become, across generations, the flood. A ruined city could become the last city. A survivor could become the chosen preserver of life. But here, the story becomes more unsettling. Shuruppak was not just any city attached to a flood legend. It was associated with wisdom traditions. One of the most famous Sumerian compositions, often known as the Instructions of Shuruppak, presents advice from a father to his son. The father is Shuruppak, son of Ubaratutu, and the son is Ziusudra, the flood survivor in the Sumerian tradition. This is not the dramatic version of the flood. It is not a storm scene. It is a wisdom text. It speaks in warnings, moral sayings, social guidance, and practical advice. Do not steal. Do not murder. Do not speak arrogantly. Do not abuse power. Do not create conflict. Do not neglect proper behavior. At first glance, this seems ordinary. A father instructs a son. A tradition preserves ancient wisdom. But listen to the names. Ubaratutu is the last king before the flood in the king list. Shuruppak appears as both a city and a figure in wisdom tradition. Ziusudra becomes the one who survives the flood in Sumerian myth. A city, a father, a king, a survivor, and a catastrophe are tangled together. Why would a flood survivor be linked to teachings about how to live before disaster comes? Ancient texts do not allow us to say with certainty that the instructions of Shuruppak were written as a secret warning about the flood. That would be speculation. Historians generally understand the work as part of Sumerian wisdom literature, a tradition of moral and social instruction. But for documentary storytelling, the emotional pattern is impossible to ignore. At the edge of destruction, the tradition remembers advice. Not weapons, not treasure, not a map. Advice? It is as if the last gift of the pre-flood city was not technology, but memory. How to behave. How to survive among other humans. How not to let society destroy itself from within before the waters arrive from without. Could this be why Shuruppak mattered so deeply? Perhaps the vanished city was remembered not only because it stood before a flood, but because it represented the final attempt to preserve order. The tablets present a civilization trying to define what must not be lost: kingship, wisdom, ritual, names, and continuity. And yet the flood still comes. This tension gives the story its power. Human beings organize the world. They build cities. They create law, hierarchy, irrigation, temples, and writing. They record kings and fathers and sons. Then a force arrives that makes every system fragile. In Mesopotamian thought, the gods are not always comforting. They can create, favor, abandon, punish, argue, regret, and conceal. Divine decision is often distant from human understanding. This is one reason Mesopotamian mythology feels so psychologically modern. It does not present existence as simple. It presents humans as vulnerable beings, trying to survive inside a universe governed by powers they cannot fully control. Shuruppak stands inside that uncertainty. It is real enough to be excavated, mythic enough to belong to the age before the flood, and symbolic enough to become a vessel for questions that still disturb us. How much of human memory is history? How much is ritual? How much is trauma reshaped into sacred story? Picture the excavation mound of Tel Farah under the hard light of southern Iraq. No towering temples remain as they once stood. No city gate rises to announce the last capital before the flood. What remains are layers, fragments, tablets, pottery, architecture, traces of administration, traces of hands that touched clay and believed the marks would matter. That is the paradox of Shuruppak. The city vanished, but its name did not. The waters, whether historical flood, mythic flood, or both, did not erase everything. Something passed through. A name survived. A king survived in a list. A father survived in wisdom. A son survived in myth. A disaster survived as a sentence. Then the flood swept over. Those words are terrifying because they are brief. They do not explain themselves. They do not comfort the reader. They do not say why the flood came, who deserved it, who feared it, or what the last sunrise looked like over the roofs of Shuruppak. They leave silence, and silence is where the ancient mystery begins to breathe. What if the most important part of the story is not the flood itself, but the decision to remember one city at the edge of it? What if Shuruppak became a symbolic archive, a place where Sumerian scribes gathered their deepest anxieties about power, morality, time, and human survival? Archaeologists can uncover the city. Historians can compare the texts. Philologists can study the names and phrases. But no excavation can fully recover the emotional world of the people who first heard that kingship ended in Shuruppak and that the waters came. The city beneath the flood is not only a place on a map, it is a question pressed into clay. Why did the Sumerians imagine civilization ending not in fire, war, or invasion, but in water rising over the world they had built? What if civilization did not begin with human invention, but with a descent, not a slow discovery, not a tribe learning how to plant seeds, shape bricks, count grain, and build walls over many generations? The ancient Sumerian imagination sometimes describes the beginning of ordered society in a far more mysterious way. Kingship, the power that organized cities and gave authority to rulers, did not rise from the earth. It came down from heaven. This phrase is one of the most haunting ideas in Mesopotamian tradition. It suggests that human power was never entirely human. A king was not merely a strong man, a warrior, or the head of a wealthy family. Kingship was something greater than the king himself. It was an institution, a sacred force, a cosmic responsibility that could move from city to city as if carried by invisible hands. Ancient texts describe kingship as descending first to Eridu. That detail matters. Eridu was not remembered as just another settlement. In Sumerian tradition, it carried the aura of firstness. It was imagined as ancient even by ancient people, a sacred place linked to deep waters, divine wisdom, and the god Enki, known in later Akkadian as Ea. Enki was associated with intelligence, craft, creation, ritual knowledge, and the hidden powers beneath the earth. His domain was the Abzu, the mysterious freshwater deep beneath the world, Why would kingship begin there? If a later scribe wanted to invent a political list, why not begin with a powerful military capital, a famous dynasty, or a city known for conquest? Why begin in a place connected with water, wisdom, and the hidden foundation of existence? The ancient answer is not modern history, it is sacred memory. In the Sumerian worldview, civilization was not simply practical, it was cosmic: farming, writing, music, building, law, kingship, priesthood, weaving, metalwork, and ritual were not treated as random human habits, they were part of a larger order. A city was not complete merely because people lived there. A city became real when divine powers were present, when temples connected heaven and earth, when rituals sustained the bond between human life and the unseen world. This is where the idea of the me becomes important. The me were divine decrees, powers, or cultural principles that organized civilization. Ancient texts speak of them as sacred elements of order. They are difficult to translate into a single modern word because they can include offices, arts, social roles, ritual functions, and powers of culture. They are not objects in a simple sense, yet myths sometimes speak of them as things that can be held, transferred, guarded, or taken. This creates a strange image: civilization as something stored, civilization as something given, civilization as something that can be lost. The ancient accounts do not describe a modern theory of social development. They do not say that irrigation led to bureaucracy, or that surplus grain produced hierarchy, though historians discuss these processes when studying early cities. Instead, the myths speak in the language of divine possession. Knowledge belongs to the gods. Order belongs to the gods. Humanity receives fragments of that order and tries to live inside it. Could the Sumerians have been asking a question we still ask in another form? Where does authority come from? Modern people may answer with elections, constitutions, bloodlines, economics, violence, law, or consent. The Sumerian answer reaches into the sky. Authority descends, it is bestowed. It belongs to something larger than the person who wears the crown. But that makes kingship dangerous. If kingship comes from heaven, then a ruler is never just a ruler. He stands at the intersection of human ambition and divine expectation. He must build temples, maintain offerings, defend canals, sponsor rituals, protect order, and show that the gods still favor the city. His power is sacred, but it is also fragile. If the city fails, does that mean the king failed? If disaster comes, does that mean kingship has departed? Ancient Mesopotamian politics often imagined power moving geographically. A city might flourish for a time, then lose its central place. Another city might rise. The king list shapes this into a dramatic sequence, as if kingship itself travels. It does not simply say one ruler defeated another. It presents history as a chain of divine transfers. This is more than record-keeping. It is theology disguised as chronology. Archaeologists study Eridu through walls, pottery, temple levels, and settlement remains. They do not uncover a moment where kingship literally falls from the sky. What archaeology can show is that Eridu was an early and important settlement in southern Mesopotamia, with deep religious significance and long occupation. Its temples developed over time, layer upon layer, showing repeated rebuilding at a sacred location. That image is powerful. A temple rebuilt again and again on the same spot. Generations vanish. Rulers change. Languages shift. But the sacred place remains. Bricks decay and are replaced. Walls collapse and rise again. The mound grows higher with every act of devotion. The city becomes not only a place, but a memory, stacked in clay. What would it feel like to live near such a sight? A child walking beside a parent might see priests entering a temple whose foundations reached into stories older than anyone alive. An old man might say that the gods had been honored there since the beginning. A scribe might copy a text claiming that kingship first descended in that city, not because he witnessed it, but because tradition told him that human order began there. Modern historians approach this carefully. They do not treat the supernatural claim as evidence that divine kingship physically descended. They study what the claim meant. It reveals how Sumerian scribes understood legitimacy, memory, and the sacred structure of political life. It shows that kingship was not merely administration. It was part of the way people explained why cities existed at all. Yet the image remains unsettling. A force comes down from heaven. It enters a city. It gives human beings structure. Then, at some point, it leaves. Why would divine kingship move? Ancient texts often imply that cities can lose favor. Sometimes the gods abandon a city. Sometimes a city falls because of divine decision, enemy attack, internal corruption, or fate. In later Mesopotamian laments, ruined cities are described in heartbreaking language, as if the city itself had been deserted by its god. The destruction of a city was not only physical, it was spiritual abandonment. That concept changes how we hear the phrase kingship descended from heaven. It is not simply an origin story, it is a warning. What descends can ascend. What is granted can be withdrawn. What begins in glory can end in silence. Eridu's association with Enki deepens the mystery further. Enki is one of the most fascinating figures in Mesopotamian mythology. He is wise, cunning, creative, protective, and sometimes unpredictable. He is not only a god of water, but of intelligence, hidden below the visible surface. His wisdom comes from depth. The Abzu, his watery realm, was not an ocean in the ordinary sense. It was the cosmic freshwater deep, imagined as lying beneath the earth, in a land where irrigation meant life. Hidden sweet water was not a minor symbol. It represented fertility, renewal, and unseen support. The visible city depended on invisible waters. What if Eridu's firstness is tied to this idea? A city rises above the mud, but its sacred power comes from below. Kingship descends from heaven, but its first home is connected to the deep. Heaven above, waters below, human civilization in between. This vertical image appears again and again in ancient religious imagination. Temples reach upward, foundations go downward. Rituals connect the human middle world to divine heights and mysterious depths. A city becomes a meeting point between realms. Modern interpretation sometimes sees this as a symbolic map of consciousness. That does not mean the Sumerians thought in modern psychological terms. It means their images continue to speak to human experience. We feel that society depends on visible rules, but also on invisible trust. We build institutions, but they rest on beliefs. We obey laws, but only because a shared story gives them meaning. The Sumerians placed that shared story in the realm of the gods. Still, there is a disturbing question hidden in the king list. If kingship began as a divine gift, why did the earliest kings reign for impossible lengths of time? The pre-flood rulers are assigned reigns so vast that they break ordinary historical imagination. Tens of thousands of years pass under single names. Modern historians generally interpret these numbers as symbolic, legendary, ideological, or tied to ancient numerical systems, not literal lifespans in the modern biological sense. But the exaggeration is meaningful. It tells us that the world before catastrophe was imagined as radically different from the world of normal human kings. The First Age was not ordinary time. It was mythic time. In mythic time, things are larger. Kings live beyond human limits. Cities hold cosmic weight. Divine and human realities blur. A reign is not just a period of governance, it is an age of the world. Why magnify the past so dramatically? Perhaps because ancient societies often used deep antiquity to authorize the present. The older something was, the more sacred it could appear. A law, temple, ritual, or royal office gained power by being linked to origins. To say this began at the beginning was to say it belonged to the structure of reality. But another possibility is more emotional. Maybe the exaggerated numbers express distance. The scribes knew they were speaking of a world beyond reach. The enormous reigns create a feeling that the first cities belong to a horizon so far away that ordinary measurement fails. Time itself becomes a kind of veil. Behind that veil stands Eridu, not merely a ruin, not merely a name, a threshold. The first city of kingship carries the idea that human civilization began through contact with the divine. Yet this contact did not make civilization safe. It made it meaningful, and meaning can intensify fear, because if history has sacred order, then disaster may also have sacred meaning. The earliest city, then, is not comforting. It is charged with uncertainty. A gift descends, a king rules, a temple rises. The deep waters nourish the land. The people trust that order has been established. But somewhere inside the ancient imagination, there is also the knowledge that order is never permanent. What kind of gift is kingship, if the cities that receive it can still vanish? Section 3. What if the oldest map in the Sumerian imagination was not drawn with roads, rivers, or borders, but with names? 5 names: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. They appear like stepping stones across a vanished age, not as ordinary settlements competing for land, but as stations in a sacred sequence. Kingship does not remain still. It arrives in one city, then passes to another, then another, as though history itself is being carried across southern Mesopotamia by a power no human hand can fully hold. This is not geography in the modern sense. There are no measured distances, no coordinates, no carved map showing the path from one city to the next. The ancient record gives something stranger, a chain of memory. Each city becomes a point of light in a world that is said to have existed before the Great Flood. But why these 5? Why would the scribes preserve these names as the cities of the First Age? Why not dozens of settlements? Why not the largest urban centers known from later history? Why arrange the beginning of civilization as a sequence of chosen places. The ancient texts describe the movement of kingship as if it belongs to a cosmic pattern. Modern archaeology asks a different kind of question. Did these places exist? Can they be identified? Do they correspond to real ruins, real communities, real landscapes where people built, traded, prayed, farmed, and died? The answer is complicated. Some of the names connect to known ancient sites or strong scholarly identifications. Others are more uncertain. The physical world does not always match the mythic list cleanly. A name may survive while its exact location remains debated. A city may be remembered in myth more vividly than it appears in excavation. A sacred reputation may grow larger than the settlement itself. This is where the mystery becomes more powerful, not less. The five cities form what might be called an antediluvian geography, a geography of the world before the flood. Not a complete map, but a symbolic route through origins. Each city seems to hold a different kind of meaning, almost as if the Sumerians were placing pieces of civilization in separate sacred containers. Eridu carries the aura of beginnings and deep wisdom. Bad Tibira is remembered in connection with metalwork, craft, and divine association. Its name has often been interpreted as having to do with the wall or fortress of metalworkers, though ancient place names can carry layers of meaning that are difficult to capture in modern translation. In later tradition, it is linked with gods associated with shepherding, fertility, and sacred order. Larak is more mysterious. It appears in the antediluvian sequence, but compared with the more famous cities, it remains shadowed. Its location has been debated. Its role in the list feels almost like a missing room in an ancient temple, named by the plan, but not fully entered by modern knowledge. Sippar stands under the sign of the sun. It was associated with the sun god Utu, known later as Shamash, a deity connected with justice, vision, truth, and judgment. A city of the sun placed in the world before the flood is not a small detail. It suggests illumination within the oldest layer of memory. And Shurupak, the final city in the sequence, becomes the edge of catastrophe. 5 cities, 5 sacred tones, wisdom, craft, mystery, sunlight, warning. Is this accidental? Historians are cautious. They do not claim that the king list was designed as a coded spiritual map in the way modern mystery seekers might imagine. The text belongs to scribal and political traditions. It presents kingship as a single institution moving between cities. It reflects ideology, memory, and theological thinking. It is not a secret atlas in a modern occult sense, but ancient people did not separate politics, religion, landscape, and memory the way modern categories do. A city could be a political center, a divine dwelling place, a ritual machine, a symbol, and a historical claim all at once. To name a city was to invoke its god, its temple, its traditions, its place in the ordered world. So when the text names 5 cities before the flood, it does more than list places. It creates a sacred architecture of time. Imagine a scribe seated in a temple school, copying names from an older tradition. The clay is wet. The reed stylus presses wedges into the surface. Each city name carries weight. Perhaps the young scribe has never seen all these places. Perhaps one of them is already diminished. Perhaps one is famous only through tradition, yet the names must be copied correctly because they belong to the memory of beginnings. What if the copying itself was an act of preservation? A city that loses its walls can still survive in a tablet. A place buried under alluvium can still breathe through a name. The 5 cities may represent real memories of ancient settlements, but the list also turns them into something more durable than brick. It makes them part of cosmic history. This is a profound idea. The Sumerians lived in a land where cities were vulnerable. Mud brick returns to mud. Rivers wander. Canals silt up. Salt damages fields. Invaders arrive. Temples burn. The landscape itself does not preserve human ambition kindly. Stone monuments survive better in Egypt than mud brick walls survive in southern Iraq. Mesopotamia needed writing because the world around it was always erasing. Clay became resistance against disappearance. Yet clay is fragile too. Tablets break. Lines vanish. Fire can destroy or preserve depending on chance. Many ancient texts survive only because disaster baked them hard. Memory reaches us through accident. The 5 cities before the flood are therefore not only mythic places, they are survivors of a deeper struggle between remembrance and loss. Bad Tibira offers one of the most intriguing examples. In the antediluvian list, it receives kingship after Eridu. The reigns assigned to its rulers are enormous, belonging to mythic time. Ancient tradition links the city with figures whose names are difficult for modern readers, but would have sounded meaningful to scribes trained in Sumerian lore. The city's association with divine craftsmen and metalworkers opens a striking possibility for interpretation. Craft in Mesopotamia was never merely technical. To shape metal, carve stone, build a temple, or fashion divine statues was to participate in a sacred transformation of matter. Raw material became order. The hidden became visible. The lifeless could be ritually awakened into a divine image. Craft stood at the boundary between human skill and supernatural presence. So why place a city associated with craft so close to the beginning? Modern interpretation may see this as a memory of specialized labor and early urban complexity. When societies become cities, labor divides. Some farm, some build, some administer, some serve temples, some create objects of power and beauty. Myth turns this social transformation into sacred inheritance. Then comes Larak, a name that resists easy storytelling. And that resistance matters. Not every ancient name opens itself to us. Some remain partially sealed. Larak appears in the sequence, receives kingship, then gives way. The text offers little narrative color. No famous modern image attaches to it as strongly as Eridu or Sipar. It is a reminder that the antediluvian world is not a complete picture. It is a damaged mural, with certain figures bright and others almost faded away. What if Larak's importance was once obvious? What if stories, hymns, or local traditions once explained its place? But those texts are lost. The absence becomes part of the mystery. Ancient history is not only what survives, it is also the shape of what is missing. A name without a story can be more haunting than a full myth, because it proves that a tradition existed while denying us the key to understand it. Then Sipar appears, and the symbolic atmosphere changes. Sippar's connection with the sun god brings light into the sequence. Utu or Shamash was the god who saw all things. The sun crosses the sky and witnesses human action, because nothing can hide from daylight. The sun god becomes linked with justice and judgment. In Mesopotamian art, Shamash is often associated with radiance, authority, and the opening of truth. A city of sunlight in the world before the flood raises a subtle question. Was the earliest civilization imagined as seen by the gods? Justice depends on visibility. Wrongdoing hides in darkness. The sun exposes. In many cultures, light becomes a symbol of truth, judgment, and divine knowledge. Ancient Mesopotamia gives this idea a sharply legal and cosmic form. The sun god is not only warm and bright, he is witness. If Sippar belongs among the first cities, then the antediluvian geography is not merely political. It includes moral vision. A world before catastrophe is still a world under observation, and this makes the coming destruction even more disturbing. If the gods saw everything, what did they see? The five cities create a rising tension. They begin with sacred origin, pass through craft and hidden tradition, move into the light of judgment, and end with a city remembered at the brink of overwhelming water. Whether this pattern was intended by the ancient scribes in exactly this way cannot be proven, but as preserved tradition, the sequence invites reflection. Ancient texts describe a sacred chain. Archaeologists investigate scattered ruins and uncertain identifications. Historians see ideological memory shaped by scribal culture. Modern interpreters ask whether the sequence preserves echoes of real settlements, theological symbolism, or both. No single approach exhausts the mystery. A purely historical reading cannot explain why these names became charged with mythic power. A purely mythological reading risks forgetting that real people lived in real mud brick cities beneath the same dangerous sky. A purely symbolic reading may become too clever and drift beyond the evidence. The truth may lie in the tension between all three. The antediluvian cities are neither simple facts nor simple fantasies. They are remembered places transformed by sacred imagination. This is how ancient memory often works. A real location becomes a story. A story becomes a ritual. A ritual becomes identity. Centuries later, the original event is no longer visible, but the pattern remains. People continue to repeat the names because the names hold the world together. What if these five cities were not meant to tell us only where kingship went? What if they were meant to show what civilization must contain in order to exist? Wisdom, craft, hidden continuity, justice, warning. A city is not just walls. A city is knowledge, labor, memory, law, and the fear of collapse. The Sumerians understood this with terrifying clarity. Their world was built from mud and water, but their stories were built from cosmic tension. Order had to be received, maintained, transferred, and remembered. The five cities before time may be the oldest surviving attempt to describe civilization as a fragile chain. And if one link breaks, what happens to the whole world? What kind of place becomes ancient before history even learns how to count itself? Eridu was remembered as a beginning, but archaeology gives that memory a physical weight. beneath later levels of occupation, beneath broken walls and wind-worn surfaces, beneath the dust of collapsed buildings, excavators uncovered a long sequence of temple remains. One sacred place had been rebuilt again and again, generation after generation, as if the location itself mattered more than any single structure raised upon it. That is the first surprise. Eridu was not only remembered in myth, it was repeatedly returned to in practice. A shrine does not rebuild itself. Every new layer means labor, hands shaping bricks, workers carrying clay, priests maintaining ritual, communities deciding that this spot, not another spot nearby, deserved renewal. Long before the great cities of Mesopotamia became famous for kings, armies, and monumental inscriptions, Eridu held a sacred continuity that stretched deep into the early phases of southern Mesopotamian life. Archaeologists often connect early Eridu with the Ubaid period, a prehistoric culture that existed before the fully developed Sumerian city-states of the 3rd millennium BCE. This matters because it places Eridu's importance in a world older than writing, as we usually imagine it in Mesopotamia. It belongs to a time when villages were growing, ritual centers were developing, and the social foundations of later urban life were forming slowly in the river plain. The ancient texts speak in the language of divine beginnings. Archaeology speaks in layers. Between them is a silence that asks to be interpreted carefully. The earliest temple levels at Eridu were not gigantic in the way later ziggurats would be. They were smaller, simpler, and deeply human. Yet their repeated rebuilding suggests that people had already begun to mark certain spaces as set apart. Sacred architecture did not suddenly appear fully formed. It grew, and that growth is one of the most important clues to the birth of civilization. Why would a community keep rebuilding a temple? A purely practical building might be moved, abandoned, expanded wherever convenient. A sacred building gathers memory. It becomes powerful because ancestors prayed there, offerings were placed there, ceremonies were performed there, and stories attached themselves to the ground. The place begins to feel chosen. This is one of the most mysterious transformations in human history. At some point, people stop seeing land as only land. A mound becomes holy. A spring becomes the mouth of the deep. A platform becomes a meeting point with gods. A room of brick becomes a chamber where invisible powers are believed to receive offerings. Once this transformation happens, architecture is no longer just shelter. It becomes a stage for the unseen. In Eridu, that stage was tied to water. The city lay in the southern Mesopotamian environment, near marshlands and watercourses that shaped life at every level. The landscape was not a dry desert in the simple popular imagination. It was a world of reeds, canals, mudflats, pools, fish, birds, shifting channels, and cultivated fields made possible by water management. Life emerged from the negotiation between human planning and watery instability. This helps explain why the god associated with Eridu was Enki, Lord of Wisdom and the subterranean freshwater deep. The connection is not accidental in the symbolic world of Mesopotamia. Fresh water made fields grow. Hidden water suggested unseen abundance. The deep was not merely beneath the ground. It was beneath reality, a mysterious source from which life and knowledge could rise. To associate a city with that deep was to place it at the root of existence. Imagine approaching Eridu when its sacred precinct still lived. The horizon is low and wide. The air carries the smell of mud, reeds, animals, and smoke. People move through the settlement with baskets, jars, tools, and offerings. A raised sacred building stands apart, not necessarily enormous by later standards, but meaningful because of what it represents. The temple is not only a structure, it is a claim that the human community has contact with a source older and deeper than itself. What if the first city was not primarily a marketplace or fortress, but a ritual center? Modern historians do not reduce early urban development to one cause: irrigation, trade, population growth, agricultural surplus, administration, craft specialization, and religious authority all played roles. But Eridu forces attention toward the sacred. It suggests that the temple was not decoration added after society became complex. The temple may have been one of the engines of complexity itself. Offerings must be gathered. Workers must be organized. Storage must be managed. Calendars must be observed. Ritual specialists must maintain correct practice. The gods must be fed, honored, praised, and consulted. From the outside, this may look like religion. From inside the society, it was survival. If divine favor maintained order, then ritual was not optional. A neglected temple was not simply an empty building. It was a danger to the entire community. This is where Eridu becomes more than a ruin. It becomes a laboratory of ancient human dependence. People were learning how to live together in larger, more organized groups. But larger communities create new anxieties. Who decides who distributes food? Who speaks for the gods? Who has access to sacred knowledge? How does a community prevent conflict? How does it explain misfortune? One answer was the temple. The temple stood as center, memory, storehouse, symbol, and authority. It made the city feel rooted not only in soil, but in cosmic order. Yet the deeper we look, the stranger it becomes. The earliest sacred layers at Eridu predate the fully literate myths that later describe Enki and the first city. This means archaeology cannot simply prove the myths in a direct way. The people who built early shrines did not leave us full written explanations in the earliest levels. Later, Sumerian and Babylonian texts look backward and give Eridu a mythic identity. The material remains show long sacred use. The texts give that sacred use a divine story. The two are connected, but not identical. That distinction matters because it protects the mystery from false certainty. We cannot say that the first builders of Eridu thought exactly like later scribes. We cannot place later myths unchanged into prehistoric minds. But we can say that Eridu's ancient sacred importance was real enough that later tradition remembered it as a beginning. Memory grows around places that refuse to disappear. Eridu eventually declined in political importance, yet its spiritual reputation endured. That is another surprise. Some cities are remembered because they ruled empires, others because they were battlefields. Eridu was remembered because it felt primordial. Its power was not only in what it controlled, but in what it symbolized. There is something psychologically profound in that. Human beings search for first places, the first homeland, the first temple, the first king, the first word, the first moment when chaos became order. We want beginnings because beginnings promise meaning. If we can find where something began, perhaps we can understand what it was meant to be. Eridu became one of those beginnings. But beginnings can be dangerous. They attract imagination. They become larger than evidence. Later generations may project dreams onto them. Priests may claim authority through them. Kings may connect themselves to them. Writers may use them to explain mysteries that belong as much to theology as to memory. So what can be known? Archaeologists know there was an ancient settlement at Eridu with significant sacred architecture and long occupation. Historians know later Mesopotamian tradition treated Eridu as extremely ancient and sacred. Ancient texts describe it as the first city to receive kingship and as the home of Enki's deep wisdom. Modern interpreters suggest that Eridu's mythic status may preserve a memory of early religious centrality in southern Mesopotamia. What remains uncertain is the transformation itself. How did a real sacred settlement become the first city of cosmic memory? There is no single tablet that explains the process. No priest left a confession saying when Eridu became the beginning. No king carved a statement telling us how old stories attached themselves to the mound. The change happened through centuries of ritual, repetition, storytelling, and reverence. A place becomes sacred slowly. Then suddenly, everyone believes it has always been sacred. The temple levels at Eridu offer an image of this process. Each rebuilding covers and preserves what came earlier. The newest structure stands on the bones of older ones. The past is not erased. It becomes foundation. People may not see the earliest shrine beneath their feet, but their ritual world depends on it. That is exactly how cultural memory works. The visible story rests on buried layers. This may explain why Eridu held such force in the Sumerian imagination. It embodied depth. Its god was Lord of the Deep. Its temples were layered in depth. Its memory reached into temporal depth. Everything about it pointed downward, toward hidden foundations, and yet its kingship descended from above. The sacred city joins two impossible directions. Heaven sends authority. The deep sends wisdom. Human beings build in the middle, fragile and ambitious, trying to hold both. This is why Eridu still feels mysterious. It is not because it proves that the gods literally walked through its streets. It is because real archaeology and ancient myth meet there without canceling each other. The ruins do not explain away the story. The story does not replace the ruins. Together, they reveal how early humans made meaning in a world where water, mud, sky, and fear were never separate. Stand in imagination on the mound of Eridu at dusk. The old temple is gone. The voices are gone. The offerings are dust. The canals have shifted. The gods no longer receive food in the old rooms, but the question remains alive in the ruins. When a civilization says its first city was built beside the deep, was it remembering a place, a theology, or the moment human beings first realized they needed the sacred in order to survive? What kind of warning survives when the tablet that carried it is broken? The Sumerian flood tradition does not come to us as a perfect story. It comes damaged, interrupted, scarred by time. Lines are missing. Words vanish at the edges. Whole moments seem to fall into silence just when the listener most wants to hear them. A god is speaking. Then the text breaks. A decision is being made. Then the clay no longer tells us what came next. A human being is chosen, but the full emotional weight of that choice has to be reconstructed from fragments. This is not a weakness of the story. It is part of its power. The ancient account associated with Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood survivor, is among the oldest forms of the great Mesopotamian flood memory. Later traditions give fuller versions of the tale, with other names and expanded scenes. But the Sumerian fragments preserve something raw. The story feels like a message pulled from the edge of destruction, not polished into complete literary certainty, but surviving as if by accident. Ziusudra is not introduced to us like a modern hero. He is not surrounded by personal ambition, romance, or military glory. His significance comes from listening. In the surviving tradition, he is linked to piety, kingship, divine instruction, and survival through a catastrophe that overwhelms the human world. He becomes important because he hears what others do not hear, or perhaps because he is allowed to receive what others are denied. That is a frightening thought. What if survival depends not on strength, but on a message? What if an entire world can continue only because one person listens at the right moment? Ancient texts describe gods debating, deciding, concealing, revealing. They do not present the flood as a random accident in the mythic imagination. It emerges from divine will, divine conflict, or divine judgment, depending on the version and tradition. The human beings below are not given equal access to the truth. Most live under the sky without knowing what has been decided above them. This pattern appears often in Mesopotamian myth. The gods possess knowledge. Humans live inside consequences. Ziusudra stands at the narrow passage between the two. In the Sumerian flood story, the details are incomplete, yet the basic tension remains clear. A catastrophic flood is coming. The gods have made a decision. A human figure receives warning. Life must somehow be preserved. The world that emerges from the waters is not the same world that existed beneath the old order. Modern readers often want the ancient text to behave like a report. Who warned him? Exactly what did the warning say? How large was the vessel? How many animals were saved? How many days did the storm last? Where did the survivor land? What happened to every city? The Sumerian evidence does not satisfy that hunger completely. It leaves us with gaps. But gaps are not empty. They reveal the distance between us and the people who first told the story. They remind us that ancient memory is not a window we can simply open. It is a cracked surface, and through the cracks we glimpse firelight, ritual, fear, and theology. Picture a tablet fragment lying in a museum drawer or on a scholar's desk. It is small enough to hold in the hand, but it carries a disaster larger than any hand can contain. The signs are pressed into clay by someone who did not know that thousands of years later, strangers would stare at those wedges trying to recover a vanished world. Perhaps the scribe copied from an older tablet. Perhaps the story had already lived for generations in temple schools and oral tradition. Perhaps every copy preserved and changed the memory at once. A flood story is never only about water. It is about what a culture fears losing in Sumer, what might be lost cities, temples, canals, seed grain, animals, names, rituals, royal authority, human continuity, and the connection between people and gods. A flood destroys not only bodies, but systems. It dissolves boundaries. It makes fields indistinguishable from river. It turns streets into channels. It pulls walls back toward mud. In a land built from clay, water is creation and undoing. This dual nature gives the story its psychological force. The same element that nourishes life can erase it. The same rivers that make civilization possible can become instruments of collapse. The same mud that forms tablets can swallow buildings. The people of southern Mesopotamia did not need imagination alone to understand this. Their environment taught it. Still, the mythic flood is more than an environmental memory. Ancient texts turn disaster into moral and cosmic drama. A flood that might begin as river behavior becomes a story about divine power. A local catastrophe can become a universal boundary. A survivor can become not merely lucky, but chosen. Why is Ziusudra chosen? The surviving Sumerian evidence does not give a simple modern answer. His name is often interpreted in connection with long life, and he appears as a pious figure. Later Mesopotamian flood heroes, under different names, are often described as wise, devout, or favored by a god. This suggests a pattern: the survivor is not merely physically rescued. He represents the preservation of a relationship between humanity and the divine. That matters because the flood threatens more than population. It threatens meaning. If everyone dies, who will make offerings? Who will remember the gods' names? Who will rebuild temples? Who will plant fields? Who will speak the old words? A world without humans may be quiet, but in Mesopotamian thought, that quiet is not necessarily good. Human beings serve a role in the divine economy. They labor, worship, feed the gods through offerings, and maintain ritual order. So the flood survivor preserves both life and service. This is one of the strangest aspects of Mesopotamian religion. Humans are vulnerable, limited, and often powerless before divine decisions, yet they are also necessary. The gods may be greater, but the human world performs functions the gods value. Catastrophe threatens the arrangement itself. Ziusudra is the thread that keeps it from snapping. Now consider the emotional shape of a warning. A true warning is cruel because it arrives too early for proof. The warned person must act before the disaster is visible. When the sky is still calm, he must believe in the storm. When neighbors continue their ordinary lives, he must prepare for the impossible. When markets open, children play, animals graze, and ovens smoke, he must carry knowledge that separates him from everyone else. What would that do to a mind? The ancient text does not give us Ziusudra's private thoughts. It does not show him waking in dread or looking at the faces of people who do not know. But the situation itself creates unbearable tension. To be warned is to be isolated. To survive is to inherit grief. Modern interpretation can approach this through the psychology of disaster memory. Many cultures preserve stories in which one figure listens, obeys, builds, hides, flees, or carries knowledge through catastrophe. These stories may teach obedience, piety, preparedness, humility, or the danger of ignoring divine signs. They may also encode the emotional truth that disasters are often recognized too late by most people. Could the Sumerian flood story have functioned as a cultural warning? Not necessarily. a practical instruction to build a boat in every generation. More likely, it warned that civilization is conditional. Cities can appear permanent, but they depend on fragile balances. Human noise can rise so high, human disorder can become so great, or divine patience can become so thin, that the structure of the world itself is imagined as vulnerable. The warning is not only water may come, the deeper warning is the world can be revoked. This is why the story continues to disturb. It does not comfort the listener with the idea that progress is secure. It says the opposite. Writing exists, but writing can break. Kingship exists, but kingship can end. Temples exist, but temples can be drowned. Wisdom exists, but wisdom must be heard before it can save anyone. The flood survivor is therefore not a symbol of triumph in a simple sense. He is a symbol of continuation after terror. When the waters withdraw, the survivor stands in an emptied world. The ancient versions do not all dwell on the psychological horror of that moment, but the image is unavoidable. Survival means stepping out into silence. It means seeing that the familiar pattern of life has been interrupted beyond repair. It means becoming the bridge between a drowned age and an uncertain renewal. The name Ziusudra carries that weight. He is not merely the man who lived, he is the one through whom memory crosses the waters. This gives new meaning to the association of Shurupak with instruction. A city at the edge of catastrophe produces not only a flood survivor, but a tradition of counsel. The Sumerian imagination places wisdom and destruction close together, almost as if the last defense against chaos is not force, but right conduct, listening, humility, and reverence. Yet the tablet remains broken. That brokenness prevents easy certainty. It stops modern readers from turning the story into a closed system. We do not possess every line. We do not hear every divine argument. We do not know how early audiences filled the silences. We can compare later flood traditions, but comparison is not the same as recovery. The Sumerian fragments keep their own dignity by refusing to become fully transparent, and perhaps that is fitting. A warning from a vanished city should not arrive complete. It should feel damaged by the very disaster it describes. It should make the listener lean closer. It should make every missing line feel like a door that almost opened. Somewhere in those gaps may have been the reason for the flood. Somewhere may have been the full instruction to Ziusudra. Somewhere may have been the sound of the gods deciding who would live and who would vanish. Somewhere may have been the sentence that explained why one city, one survivor, and one warning were allowed to cross the boundary of destruction. But the clay is silent where we most want it to speak. So the mystery remains suspended in fragments, like a voice heard through flood water. If Ziusudra survived because he received a warning, what message was lost in the broken lines of the tablet? Why does the last king of a vanished age feel less like a person than a shadow? His name appears with immense weight, yet almost no voice. Ubaratutu. In the ancient king tradition, he stands at a terrifying threshold. He is named as the ruler of Shurupak in the world that exists on the edge of the flood. Yet the texts do not give him a dramatic speech. They do not show him leading armies, building a palace, begging the gods, or watching waters rise against the city walls. He appears almost like a final marker on the road of memory, a name, a reign, a city Then catastrophe. This is one of the strangest things about ancient tradition. Sometimes the figure closest to the mystery is the least explained. A minor king from a later dynasty may receive inscriptions, victories, titles, temple dedications, and political claims, but Ubara Tutu, placed at the end of the First Age, remains dim. The silence around him is not empty. It creates pressure. Who was this king supposed to be? Ancient texts describe him as part of a mythic royal sequence, not as a ruler documented through ordinary archives of taxes, letters, contracts, or military campaigns. Archaeologists do not possess a royal inscription from Ubara Tutu that confirms his historical life in the way later kings sometimes confirm theirs. Historians therefore treat him as a figure of tradition, part of the Sumerian memory of antediluvian kingship. But tradition does not preserve names for no reason. A name can become a vessel. It can carry authority even when biography disappears. It can stand for an entire vanished order. Ubara Tutu's power lies not in what we know about him, but in where the scribes placed him. He is not merely one more ruler. He is the last royal name before a rupture in the structure of the world. Imagine a throne room with no surviving walls, a city with no living witnesses, a king whose face is unknown. The crown remains only as an idea. That is Ubara Tutu. To understand why his placement matters, we have to enter the Sumerian idea of kingship more deeply. A king in Mesopotamia was not simply a private individual with personal ambition. He was expected to function as a caretaker of divine order. He built temples, maintained canals, supported rituals, judged disputes, commanded labor, defended the city, and displayed favor from the gods. His body was human, but his office touched the sacred. That made kingship both exalted and dangerous. A king could claim divine support, but he also carried responsibility for cosmic balance. If fields failed, enemies invaded, omens darkened, or floods destroyed the land, people might ask whether the divine order had shifted. The king stood in the exposed place between heaven, earth, and city. Ubara Tutu's shadowy presence intensifies that anxiety. If he was the last king of Shurupak in the sacred tradition, then he represents the final human holder of an office that had descended through the earliest cities. He is the man under whom the old chain reaches its end. The text does not say he caused the flood. It does not accuse him directly. It does not provide evidence for his guilt, virtue, wisdom, or failure. That absence is important. The ancient tradition does not turn him into a villain. It does not make him the tyrant whose crimes bring the waters. He is not painted as a monster. He is simply there, ruling when the age collapses. Could the most frightening kind of king be one who is not evil, but powerless? This possibility changes the emotional meaning of the story. Catastrophe does not always arrive because one wicked ruler makes one unforgivable choice. Sometimes it arrives because a whole order has reached a limit no ruler can control. In that sense, Ubara Tutu becomes a symbol of human authority at its boundary. He may sit on the throne, but the throne cannot command the floodwaters. The crown cannot stop chaos. The palace cannot negotiate with the deep. The scribal record cannot hold back the storm. There is another subtle layer. In the wisdom tradition, the figure named Shurupak is called the son of Ubara Tutu, and gives instruction to his son Ziusudra. This creates a family pattern around the flood memory. Ubara Tutu stands as the elder royal figure. Shurupak becomes both city and wise, fatherly voice. Ziusudra becomes the survivor. The tradition arranges catastrophe across generations. Grandfather, father, son, king, teacher, survivor. That structure is deeply human. It turns cosmic disaster into inheritance. The flood is not only something that happens to a population, it passes through a family line of memory. One generation holds authority, another gives counsel, another receives survival. What if this is the real emotional architecture of the myth? Ancient peoples did not preserve history only through monuments. They preserved it through lineage, household instruction, names spoken across generations, and stories told around duty. A father teaching a son could become as important as a king ruling a city. Wisdom moves where power cannot. Ubara Tutu's name therefore carries a tragic dignity. He is linked to authority, but not to the saving act. He belongs to the world that cannot continue. The survivor is not the old king himself in the Sumerian pattern, but the later figure connected with wisdom and divine favor. This suggests a powerful idea. The future may not be secured by the throne, but by what the throne passes down. Not armies, not wealth, not walls, instruction. The ancient account gives no detailed portrait of Ubara Tutu's rule. Modern interpretation must be careful not to invent one. We cannot say what he believed, what he feared, or how he died. We cannot describe his final day as fact, but we can explore why a tradition might place a king like him at the end of sacred time. Kings are often used as chronological anchors. They give order to memory. In the reign of this king becomes a way to locate events. When a king stands immediately near a catastrophe, his name becomes attached to that catastrophe forever, even if he did not cause it. He becomes the face of an ending. This happens throughout human memory. A final emperor becomes the symbol of a fallen empire. A last ruler becomes associated with decadence, invasion, or divine abandonment. A name at the end of a dynasty carries more burden than a name in the middle. People look backward and ask what went wrong. They search the final reign for clues. Was there corruption? Was there warning? Was there arrogance? Was there simply fate? With Ubara Tutu, the text denies us answers. That denial keeps him haunting. There is also the matter of the impossible reigns. The antediluvian kings are credited with durations beyond normal human life. This is not standard historical time. It is magnified, sacred, distant. Ubara Tutu belongs to that expanded world. His reign is not meant to feel ordinary. The numbers push him away from common human scale and into the realm of primeval kingship. Modern historians often understand such figures as mythological or legendary rather than verifiable monarchs. But mythological does not mean meaningless. These reigns communicate that the first age was imagined as larger, slower, and more mysterious. Time itself seemed different. Kings were not merely rulers of years, they were rulers of ages. Why give the final king such an immense frame? Perhaps because the collapse had to match the scale of what was collapsing. A small world can end in a local tragedy. A mythic world requires a cosmic flood. A reign measured in vast numbers makes the coming rupture feel like the breaking of a whole era, not the fall of one town. Visualize the royal court of Shurupak as imagination, not evidence. The city is alive with scribes and officials. Grain is counted in storage rooms. Offerings move toward sacred spaces. Canal workers speak of water levels. Priests watch omens in the sky and the bodies of animals. Messengers arrive from nearby settlements. The king hears petitions, perhaps surrounded by symbols of power whose meanings are now lost to us. Outside, the plain stretches flat and vulnerable. Everything depends on control. Water in canals, labor in fields, words on tablets, offerings in temples, authority in the palace. But beneath every form of control lies the ancient fear that control is temporary. That fear may be why the last king is so compelling. Ubaratutu is not remembered for conquering the world. He is remembered for standing at the point where control fails. His name is the last official human sound before the text gives way to overwhelming water. This makes him different from heroic survivors. Survivors become bridges. Final kings become doors that close. A bridge invites movement. A door marks separation. The ancient scribes may not have intended modern readers to feel sympathy for Ubaratutu, yet it is difficult not to. He is trapped in placement. He cannot escape his role. Every time the list is read, he rules again at the edge of disaster. Every time his name appears, the listener knows what is coming. He has no chance to change the story. In that sense, Ubaratutu is one of the earliest tragic figures in the imagination of civilization. Not tragic because we know his heart, tragic because we know his position. The king before darkness, the authority before silence, the human name before the waters. And still, the question remains unresolved. Did the tradition preserve Ubaratutu because he represented a remembered ruler from deep antiquity, because his name belonged to a sacred genealogy of wisdom, or because every great catastrophe needs a final king to stand at the edge of the world? What if the most important sentence in the ancient flood story is the one we no longer possess? A missing line can be more powerful than a preserved paragraph. A preserved paragraph tells us what a scribe wrote. A missing line forces us to confront everything that time has taken away. It creates a dark space inside the story, and into that space rush every question the listener cannot silence. Who spoke? What was commanded? Why was humanity threatened? What did the survivor know that the rest of the world did not? The ancient Sumerian flood account reaches us through damaged clay, and that damage changes the way the story feels. It does not arrive as a smooth, sacred book, copied perfectly across ages. It arrives as fragments, with wounds in the text. The clay has edges where signs vanish. The narrative breaks at crucial moments. The rhythm of the ancient voice is interrupted by absence. This is where the work of modern scholars becomes almost detective work. A tablet is not simply read. It is examined like a ruin. The shape of each wedge matters. The angle of a sign matters. A broken corner can remove the difference between one meaning and another. A repeated phrase from another composition may help restore a damaged line, but restoration is not the same as certainty. The scholar must ask what the text probably said, what it might have said, and what cannot honestly be known. That caution is essential. Ancient texts describe gods, kings, cities, rituals, storms, and survival. Archaeology preserves the clay objects that carried those descriptions. Historians study how those objects moved through scribal culture. Modern interpretation tries to understand why the stories mattered. But none of these approaches has permission to fill every gap with imagination and call it fact. A missing line must remain partly missing. And yet the missing lines are exactly where the mind wants to go. Picture a scholar leaning over a tablet fragment under controlled light. The surface is not smooth. It is marked by time, pressure, salt, fracture, and the ancient hand of a scribe who pressed symbols into wet clay with a reed stylus. Some signs remain sharp. Others are rubbed down until they look like faint scars. The scholar compares sign lists, other copies, grammatical patterns, and parallel traditions. Each wedge is a clue. This is not treasure hunting in the simple sense. It is the archaeology of language. Cuneiform does not speak immediately to the modern eye. It must be deciphered through training, comparison, and deep patience. Sumerian itself is not related to the major language families around it in any simple way. It stands alone, isolated, difficult, and ancient. To read a Sumerian myth is to cross not only thousands of years, but an enormous distance in how language organizes reality. A broken Sumerian tablet is therefore a double mystery. The object is damaged. The language is distant. The world behind the language is gone. What survives is not merely information, but a trace of thought. The flood story fragments are part of a larger scribal universe. Mesopotamian scribes did not copy myths only for entertainment. Texts lived in schools, temples, archives, and scholarly traditions. Young scribes practiced signs, copied proverbs, learned lists, absorbed myths, and trained their hands to reproduce a civilization's memory. Clay tablets were instruments of education as much as containers of literature. This matters because a myth copied in a scribal setting may carry more than narrative. It can preserve tradition, theology, vocabulary, grammar, prestige, and identity. A student copying an old story learns how to write, but also learns what the culture believes is worth remembering. Through repetition, a myth becomes part of the mind of the scribal class. The missing lines, therefore, do not belong only to one story. They belong to a whole system of transmission. How many tablets once existed that carried fuller versions of the flood account? How many were broken, reused, discarded, buried, dissolved, or never excavated? How many stories vanished because clay returned to earth before anyone could find it? The survival of ancient literature is not fair. Some texts endure because a building burned and baked the tablets hard. Some vanish because they were kept in places where dampness destroyed them. Some are known from many copies. Others survive in a single damaged witness. A composition's importance in antiquity does not always match its survival in modern museums. This creates a humbling truth. Our picture of Sumerian mythology may be shaped as much by accident as by ancient intention. A myth might look minor today because only fragments survive. Another might appear central because many copies happen to be preserved. A broken tablet may hold a tradition that once was famous in temple schools. A single missing section may contain an explanation that would change the way modern readers understand the entire story. But evidence must govern desire. Scholars can compare the Sumerian flood material with later Akkadian traditions, including fuller flood accounts preserved in Mesopotamian literature. These comparisons are valuable because they reveal patterns, divine decision, secret warning, vessel, storm, survival, sacrifice, and a transformed relationship between humans and gods. Yet comparison has limits. Later versions may expand, reshape, reinterpret, or theologize older material. They cannot simply be pasted into the missing Sumerian gaps as if nothing changed. This is one of the great tensions in studying ancient myth. The versions speak to each other, but they are not the same voice. A later storyteller may sharpen moral themes. A scribe may adapt a name to a new language. A city tradition may become part of a wider imperial literature. A god's role may change as theology evolves. What begins in one cultural setting can be carried into another, gaining new details while preserving older bones. So when a Sumerian tablet breaks, later texts can illuminate the darkness, but they cannot completely replace the lost light. The physical tablet also teaches something about time. Clay feels permanent when fired, but temporary when unfired. Many tablets were not intended as eternal monuments. They were practical objects, school exercises, administrative records, library copies, or ritual texts. The ancient scribe did not always write for a museum thousands of years away. He wrote for a living institution that changes the emotion of the fragment. The tablet was once ordinary enough to handle. Now it is almost sacred to us because it is one of the few surviving doors into an early world. There is a strange reversal here. The ancient scribe may have regarded the myth as old, traditional, copied, perhaps familiar. Modern people regard the surviving fragment as precious because so much has disappeared. What was routine becomes miraculous through loss, and the missing lines become a reminder that human memory is never complete. Modern culture often imagines data as recoverable. We store, back up, scan, archive, and duplicate. Yet even now, information disappears, files corrupt, languages die, websites vanish, families forget names, nations rewrite histories. The ancient broken tablet tells a universal truth: preservation is always partial. In Mesopotamia, writing was born partly from administration, from the need to count, record, allocate, and control. But writing quickly became something larger. It became a way to hold prayers, myths, hymns, omens, laws, laments, and wisdom. It became the human answer to disappearance. Still, writing could not defeat disappearance completely. The tablet with missing lines is proof. This is why the gaps feel almost philosophical. They ask whether a civilization can ever truly preserve itself. The Sumerians pressed signs into clay because speech vanishes, but clay breaks, archives scatter, languages die, scripts are forgotten. Even when rediscovered, a text depends on modern eyes to recover its meaning. Memory survives through a chain of fragile acts. A scribe copies, a tablet dries, a building collapses, a fragment sleeps underground. An excavator finds it, a scholar reads it, a listener imagines it. At any point, the chain could break. Perhaps this is why flood stories are so fitting for Mesopotamia. The flood is a myth of overwhelming loss, and the surviving tablet is itself a survivor of overwhelming loss. The object and the story mirror each other. A fragment about catastrophe reaches us through catastrophe. A tale of preservation is preserved only partially. A story about the danger of total erasure comes to us almost erased. What if the broken condition of the text is not merely an obstacle, but part of the experience? Not because ancient scribes intended the damage, but because time has turned the tablet into a symbol of its own subject. It teaches through absence. It makes modern readers feel the instability that the story describes. It refuses to let the flood become a comfortable legend. A complete story can be mastered. A broken story keeps resisting. The missing lines also protect the ancient world from overconfidence. They prevent modern interpreters from claiming too much. They leave room for humility. They remind every viewer, every reader, every scholar that ancient voices do not belong to us completely. We receive them as guests, not possessions. There may have been a fuller explanation of the divine decision. There may have been ritual details now lost. There may have been names of cities, offerings, emotions, or speeches that would have made the story feel entirely different. Or perhaps the lost lines contained something ordinary. That possibility is just as important. Mystery should not become fantasy. Not every gap hides a revelation. Some gaps may have held repeated phrases, conventional transitions, or details already known from other lines. The responsible imagination must remain balanced between wonder and restraint. Yet even ordinary missing words matter when they belong to one of humanity's oldest disaster memories. The broken tablet leaves us standing at the edge of knowledge. We can see enough to know a profound story existed. We can see enough to trace its shape. We can see enough to feel its terror. But we cannot hear the whole voice. And so the ancient clay does something no perfect manuscript could do. It makes loss visible. If the surviving lines tell us that a world was nearly erased, what might the missing lines have revealed about why that world was allowed to disappear? What if the Great Flood was not one event, but a memory made from many waters? The ancient stories speak with the force of total catastrophe. The world is overwhelmed. Cities vanish. Humanity stands on the edge of extinction. A survivor crosses the waters into a changed age. Myth gives the disaster a single, terrifying shape, as if all creation paused under storm and darkness. Archaeology gives a more complicated picture. When excavators cut into the mounds of ancient Mesopotamia, they do not find one perfectly matching flood layer spread evenly across every city, like a single sheet pulled over the land. They find deposits in some places and not in others. They find layers of silt, clay, and alluvium that indicate flooding, but those layers vary by site, date, thickness, and meaning. Some are dramatic, some are local. Some may mark river behavior rather than world-ending disaster. This difference matters. Ancient texts describe a cosmic flood. Archaeologists find evidence for real floods in a dangerous river landscape. Historians ask how environmental events become sacred memory. Modern interpreters ask why a society would transform water damage into a story about the collapse and rebirth of civilization. At first, this may seem to reduce the mystery. A flood layer is not the same as a divine judgment. A deposit of silt does not prove that the whole world drowned. But the moment we look closer, the mystery grows sharper. The question is not only whether there was one flood behind the story. The deeper question is how people living in southern Mesopotamia experienced water so intensely that flood became the image of total ending. The land itself helps explain it. Southern Mesopotamia was built by rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates carried water, sediment, fertility, danger, and unpredictability. They fed fields, filled canals, supported boats, and connected cities. But they also shifted, rose, cut banks, broke boundaries, and transformed known places into drowned landscapes. A flood in such a region could be more than inconvenience. It could be social collapse. A modern person may imagine a flood as water entering houses in an ancient city of mud brick. The disaster was more intimate. Walls softened, foundations weakened, grain stores spoiled, animals drowned or scattered, irrigation works failed, fields disappeared under mud, disease could follow, records might be lost, families could be separated. A temple economy dependent on storage, labor, offerings, and calendars could be thrown into disorder. Water did not simply cover the city, it attacked the systems that made the city possible. Think of a canal after a major flood. Its banks are broken. Its course is choked with sediment. The carefully managed flow that fed fields now behaves like an enemy. Workers must dig, repair, rebuild, and remeasure. Officials must decide who gets labor, seed, food, and protection. Priests must explain whether the gods are angry, absent, or demanding ritual restoration. A king must appear competent, even if the river has exposed his weakness. Could one season of uncontrolled water change the political fate of a city? In Mesopotamia, the answer could be yes. A city's power depended on land, grain, labor, canals, and divine prestige. If flood damage ruined fields or disrupted irrigation, people might leave. Authority might weaken. Trade might falter. A rival city might rise. The disaster might enter memory, not as a bad flood, but as the moment when the world turned. Archaeology sees physical traces. Myth remembers meaning. This is where the famous flood layers of Mesopotamian excavation become fascinating. Early archaeologists sometimes connected thick deposits of clean silt with the flood of ancient tradition. At sites such as Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak, flood deposits became part of major debates about whether a real ancient disaster lay behind Mesopotamian and later biblical flood stories. The early excitement was understandable. A deep layer of water laid sediment beneath a famous ancient city feels like myth suddenly becoming visible. But careful study made the picture less simple. The flood layers were not all the same age. They were not found uniformly everywhere. Some cities show evidence of flooding, while others do not show the same deposit at the same horizon. A deposit that looks dramatic in one excavation trench may represent a major local event rather than a universal catastrophe. Modern archaeology, therefore, does not treat these layers as proof of a single world flood. Yet it would be a mistake to dismiss them as irrelevant. They show that floods were real, powerful, and capable of leaving marks in the archaeological record. They show that ancient communities lived with environmental threats strong enough to become part of cultural memory. They suggest that the mythic flood did not arise in a world unfamiliar with flooding. It arose from a landscape where water could truly erase human order. What if the story became universal because the experience felt universal to those who endured it? A person standing in a flooded plain does not see the edge of the disaster. The horizon becomes water. Roads vanish. Fields vanish. Boundaries vanish. The world that mattered to that person may be entirely submerged. In that moment, the difference between a regional catastrophe and a cosmic one may not be emotional. For the survivor, the world has ended. This is how memory expands. A real flood destroys a city. Survivors tell their children. The children tell their children. The disaster becomes attached to kings, gods, warnings, and moral lessons. A local memory enters temple tradition. A temple tradition enters scribal school. A scribal text becomes part of a civilization's explanation of time. The flood is no longer only an event. It is the boundary between ages. The strange thing is that this transformation does not make the story less true. It makes it true in another way. Historically, the details may not describe one universal inundation. Mythologically, the flood expresses the terror of civilization facing forces beyond control. Religiously, it asks whether divine powers can withdraw protection. Psychologically, it speaks to the fear that everything built by human hands can dissolve. The sediment layer and the sacred story are not enemies. They answer different questions. The sediment says water came here. The myth asks, what does it mean when water takes everything? This distinction is vital because ancient people did not live inside modern categories. They did not say, this is geology, this is theology, this is politics, this is trauma. A flood could be all of these at once. The river's movement could be a natural process, a divine sign, a political crisis, an economic disaster, and a moral warning. The same water that left silt in a courtyard could leave fear in a culture for centuries. Imagine an excavator's trench cutting through a city mound. Layer by layer, the past appears. Pottery, ash, brick, floor, debris, another floor, a burial, a wall. Then suddenly, a band of clean flood deposit. No ordinary occupation debris, no domestic scatter, just sediment laid down by water. Above it, life resumes, people rebuild, new floors appear, new pottery, new walls. This image is almost mythic by itself. A city, water, a city again. To the archaeologist, it is stratigraphy. To the ancient storyteller, it could become death and rebirth. The ground itself seems to narrate interruption. A human world is sealed under the mark of water. Then a new human world rises on top. But there is another layer of mystery. Floods do not affect every community the same way. A poor neighborhood may suffer more than a temple precinct. Farmers may lose everything while officials preserve stores. Some families may flee to higher ground. Others may not escape. When disaster becomes myth, whose suffering is remembered, whose names vanish, whose version becomes sacred. Ancient flood stories usually preserve the survivor, the gods, the kingly world, and the cosmic decision. They do not preserve thousands of ordinary voices. Archaeology sometimes brings those voices closer, not through words, but through houses, tools, ovens, graves, and broken objects. A jar left behind can be more human than a royal name. A collapsed wall can say what a palace inscription hides. The flood beneath the myth may therefore be a story of ordinary loss, not only the fall of kingship, not only divine anger, not only cosmic reset, Families losing houses, workers losing fields, children losing parents, priests losing temples, scribes losing tablets, farmers watching the water take the seed grain meant for another year. This human scale may be why the myth survived. A story of cosmic flood gives shape to pain that is too large when counted, household by household. It turns scattered suffering into a single image. Water over everything. Modern environmental studies add another dimension. Ancient Mesopotamian civilization depended on delicate balances, irrigation without too much salinity, river access without uncontrolled flooding, agricultural surplus without collapse, central authority without rebellion, divine favor without perceived abandonment. Floods were part of a larger system of vulnerability. Cities were impressive, but they were not invincible. The Sumerian imagination understood fragility. That may be the hidden realism inside the myth, not realism in the sense of a modern newspaper report, but realism about the human condition. Every civilization believes it has mastered its environment until the environment proves otherwise. Every city believes its walls define order until water ignores them. Every ruler believes authority has weight until disaster shows how light a crown can be. This is why the Great Flood remains powerful even when archaeology complicates it. The story survives because it names a fear that has never disappeared. What happens when the systems we trust fail all at once? The ancient Mesopotamian flood tradition may preserve memories of real inundations, transformed through theology and storytelling. It may combine environmental trauma, political ideology, ritual meaning, and cosmic imagination. It may not point to one simple archaeological event, but the absence of simplicity is not the absence of depth. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that there was never only one flood. There were floods of water, floods of memory, floods of grief, floods of explanation. Each generation may have added weight to the story until the waters became large enough to cover the world. And if the myth grew from real disasters beneath the soil, what other memories are still buried under the mud of Mesopotamia, waiting to be mistaken for legend? What if the man who survived the flood did not disappear from memory, but changed his name? Ancient Mesopotamian tradition did not preserve the flood survivor in only one form. Across languages, centuries, and scribal schools, the figure appears with different names and different emphases. In Sumerian tradition, he is Ziusudra. In Akkadian literature, related survivor figures appear as Atrahasis and Utnapishtim. These names are not identical labels pasted onto the same unchanged character. They belong to different compositions, different periods, and different theological worlds. Yet the pattern is unmistakable. A human being receives hidden knowledge. A flood destroys the world. Life continues through one chosen survivor, and in one of the most profound developments in ancient literature, that survivor becomes immortal. This transformation changes everything. A flood survivor is already mysterious, but an immortal flood survivor becomes something far stranger, a living memory of a destroyed age. He is not merely a man who escaped death once. He becomes the one who stands outside normal human destiny, carrying inside himself the knowledge that civilization can end. Why would Mesopotamian scribes turn the survivor of catastrophe into a figure beyond death? The ancient texts do not give one simple explanation shared across every version. the traditions evolved. Stories were copied, adapted, expanded, translated, and reshaped. Sumerian gave way to Akkadian as the major literary language of much Mesopotamian writing. Babylonian and Assyrian scribes inherited older materials and placed them into new narrative structures. Names shifted, gods took different roles, themes deepened. This is not corruption of a story, it is the life of a story. A myth that survives for centuries must change, or it becomes a dead object. In Mesopotamia, scribes did not merely preserve the past like museum guards, they reactivated it. They placed ancient memories into new compositions. They connected old figures with new questions. The flood became more than a tale of destruction. It became a mirror for mortality itself. Nowhere is this more haunting than in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is not the flood survivor. He is the restless king of Uruk, a hero who begins with power, pride, and extraordinary strength. He builds walls, he seeks fame. He lives as if greatness can overpower limitation. But the death of his companion Enkidu shatters him. Suddenly, the mighty king sees the end waiting for every human body. He becomes terrified, not of enemies, but of mortality. So he goes searching, not for treasure, not for conquest, not for another throne. He searches for the secret of life. This is where Utnapishtim enters the story. He lives far away, beyond ordinary human reach, at the edge of the world. He is the flood survivor who was granted immortality. Gilgamesh seeks him because Utnapishtim has what every king desires, and no king can command escape from death. The flood myth now becomes part of a deeper philosophical drama. Ancient texts describe Utnapishtim telling Gilgamesh the story of the flood. The hero who wants eternal life must listen to the man who received it, but the answer is not simple. Utnapishtim's immortality is not offered as a method that Gilgamesh can easily repeat. It is not a recipe, not a spell, not a technique. It was granted under extraordinary circumstances, after a catastrophe that reset the human world. This is a devastating lesson. Gilgamesh wants the survivor's reward, but he cannot recreate the survivor's moment. He wants the exception to become a rule, but mortality remains the rule. Modern historians see this as one of the great achievements of Mesopotamian literature. The flood survivor is absorbed into a story about human limits. What may have begun as a disaster tradition becomes a meditation on death, memory, kingship, grief, and the impossible desire to become more than human. The change is subtle, but enormous. In a flood story, the question is, how can life survive destruction? In the Gilgamesh tradition, the question becomes, how can one human being endure the knowledge of death? The answer is not immortality in the body. Gilgamesh does not return as an undying man. He returns to Uruk and sees the city, the walls, the work of human hands. His journey does not abolish death. It redirects his gaze toward what humans can build, remember, and pass on. But Utnapishtim remains remote, deathless, unreachable. He is the witness no one can become. That makes him one of the most psychologically powerful figures in ancient literature. He does not simply tell Gilgamesh what happened. He embodies the burden of survival. He has crossed the boundary every human fears, yet his immortality is not presented as joyous in any simple way. He lives apart from ordinary humanity. He cannot give Gilgamesh what Gilgamesh wants. His existence proves that death can be escaped, but only in a way that cannot be repeated. What if that is more painful than never knowing immortality at all? To meet Utnapishtim is to discover that eternal life exists somewhere in story, but not for you. This is the genius of the Mesopotamian transformation. The flood survivor becomes a limit figure. He stands where myth and human longing collide. He is proof that the gods can suspend destiny, and proof that humans cannot demand it. The ancient account describes divine decisions beyond human control. The survivor is chosen, warned, preserved, and eventually placed outside normal life. Archaeologists cannot excavate immortality. Historians do not treat Utnapishtim as a verifiable deathless person living beyond the sea. What can be studied is the literary and religious meaning of the figure. He reveals how Mesopotamian thinkers explored survival, divine favor, and the boundary between human and God. That boundary was never simple. In Mesopotamian thought, humans could be close to the divine through kingship, ritual, wisdom, dreams, omens, and temple service. But they remained mortal. The gods possessed a kind of life humans did not. Death was not an accident that cleverness could permanently avoid. It was part of the structure of existence. Gilgamesh tries to cross that structure. Utnapishtim shows him that the crossing is not available. The flood survivor's immortality is therefore not merely a reward, it is a theological problem. If one man can be made deathless, why not others? If survival was granted once, why does grief continue? If the gods can preserve life, why is the human world still filled with tombs? The ancient texts do not resolve this tension neatly. They allow it to remain painful. That is why they still feel alive. They do not give the listener a comforting formula. They give a story in which wisdom comes through disappointment. There is another important development. In the Atrahasis tradition, the flood is connected to a broader explanation of humanity's creation and the gods' relationship with human labor. Humans become numerous. Their noise disturbs the divine realm. Disasters are sent. The flood becomes part of a divine attempt to reduce or control humanity. This version has its own theological intensity. It asks whether humans were created for service and whether their growth became intolerable to the powers that made them. That is a darker vision. Humanity is necessary, yet troublesome, created, yet threatened, valued, yet expendable. A flood survivor in such a tradition does not merely preserve biological life, he preserves a revised contract between gods and humans. The world that emerges must be regulated differently. Birth, death, fertility, limits, ritual obligations, and human vulnerability all become part of the post-flood order. Modern interpretation often sees these myths as ancient reflections on population, labor, divine hierarchy, and social anxiety. That does not mean the stories are coded political essays. It means they use divine drama to explore real pressures. Too many people, too much noise, too much suffering, too much uncertainty about why humans exist. Across these traditions, the survivor changes because the question changes. Ziusudra belongs to the oldest surviving Sumerian shape of the memory. Atrahasis belongs to a wider drama of creation, divine frustration, and human survival. Utnapishtim belongs to the existential crisis of Gilgamesh, where flood memory becomes the doorway into the terror of death. One figure becomes many, or perhaps many traditions gather around one ancient pattern. The movement from Sumerian to Babylonian and Assyrian literature is not just linguistic, it is spiritual and intellectual. The same catastrophe is asked to carry new meanings. A drowned city becomes a lost world. A survivor becomes a sage. A sage becomes immortal. Immortality becomes a question that breaks the heart of a king. Imagine a Babylonian scribe copying the flood passage by lamplight. The signs are no longer fresh inventions. They belong to an old tradition, already heavy with prestige. The scribe knows he is handling an ancient voice, but he also lives in a different world from the first tellers. Empires have risen, cities have fallen, gods have been renamed, elevated, merged, and reinterpreted. Yet the flood story still matters. Why? Because every age fears it is fragile. Every empire looks permanent from inside its walls. Every king imagines his name will endure. Every civilization creates records because it knows, secretly, that forgetting is possible. The flood survivor promises that something can pass through destruction, but the Gilgamesh tradition refuses to make that promise simple. Gilgamesh learns that one may gain fame, wisdom, and a deeper understanding of human life, but not the eternal body he desired. Utnapishtim remains beyond him, almost like a living tablet from a world no one else can enter. This gives the flood tradition its final turn. The true survival may not be physical immortality, it may be story. Yusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim endure because scribes copied them, clay carried them, schools taught them, ruins hid them, modern readers recovered them. The immortal survivor is immortal, partly because the story refuses to die. But that creates one last unsettling possibility. What if the ancient dream of immortality was never really about living forever in the flesh? What if it was about becoming impossible to erase? A king can die, a city can vanish, a tablet can break, but a name, if copied enough times, can pass through millennia like a survivor crossing black water. And if the flood survivor's greatest immortality is memory, who decided which names were allowed to live while the rest of the drowned world disappeared? Why would ancient scribes preserve the memory of a city swallowed by a world-ending flood? Not simply the memory of water, not simply the memory of a survivor, not simply the memory of gods making decisions beyond human reach. They preserved a city name, a royal line, a sequence of sacred places, and a sentence so brief it feels like a door closing. The flood swept over. A phrase like that does not behave like ordinary history. It does not invite the listener to imagine a local storm, a damaged field, or a canal overflowing its banks. It creates a boundary. On one side stands the age of impossible kings, first cities, divine descent, sacred wisdom, and the dream that civilization began under heavenly authority. On the other side stands the human world, rebuilt under the knowledge that order can fail. The vanished city matters because it stands at the point where memory becomes warning. Ancient texts describe a world divided by catastrophe. Archaeology shows that southern Mesopotamia was a real landscape of water, settlement, mud brick, canals, temples, floods, and fragile urban life. Historians believe the flood traditions developed through scribal memory, mythic imagination, environmental experience, and religious interpretation. Modern interpretations suggest that the story may preserve echoes of real disasters transformed into a cosmic drama about civilization itself. None of these explanations cancels the others. Together, they create something more interesting than certainty. A real flood can leave sediment in the ground. A mythic flood can leave fear in the mind. A remembered city can become the place where both kinds of evidence meet. This is why Shuruppak refuses to remain only an archaeological site. It was a city of people, labor, houses, streets, and tablets. It was also remembered as the last pre-flood seat of kingship. It became attached to wisdom tradition, to Ziusudra, to the final edge of a drowned age. Its name survived not because its walls still towered above the plain, but because scribes kept pressing it into clay. That act deserves attention. A scribe is not only a recorder. In ancient Mesopotamia, a scribe could be a guardian of cultural memory. He copied lists, hymns, myths, contracts, omens, prayers, royal inscriptions, and school texts. He participated in a civilization that understood writing as a way to hold order against disappearance. When a scribe copied the name of Shuruppak, he was not merely repeating an old word. He was helping a vanished world continue to exist. What if the city's true survival was not in stone, but in repetition? Each copy renewed the city. Each student who learned the name kept the boundary alive. Each tablet that placed Shuruppak near the flood made the city more than a ruin. It became a symbol of the last moment before human beings learned that civilization could be interrupted by forces greater than its own plans. This is a profound idea because Mesopotamia itself was built on interruption. Cities rose, declined, shifted, and were rebuilt. Rivers changed course. Dynasties claimed divine favor, then vanished. Temples were restored on ancient foundations. New rulers invoked older names. Languages changed. Sumerian remained sacred and scholarly, even when everyday speech had moved elsewhere. The whole culture lived with layers. Nothing simply disappeared. It sank, transformed, and sometimes returned in a different voice. The vanished city before the flood fits that world perfectly. It is not remembered as a simple ruin. It is remembered as a threshold between divine order and human vulnerability, a threshold between mythic time and historical time, a threshold between the dream of permanence and the knowledge of collapse. When listeners today hear about a city before the flood, the imagination often rushes toward lost technology, forbidden knowledge, hidden maps, or secret civilizations. Those ideas are powerful, but they must be handled with care. Archaeologists have not uncovered proof of an advanced lost world destroyed by a global flood in the literal sense imagined by modern fantasy. The ancient texts should not be forced to say what they do not say, but the responsible mystery is more haunting. The Sumerians did not need lasers, machines, or impossible monuments to leave us with a puzzle. They left us something deeper, one of humanity's earliest attempts to explain why civilization exists, why it can fail, and why memory must survive failure. That mystery is not smaller than modern speculation. It is larger. Because it concerns every civilization that has ever believed itself secure. The city before the flood becomes a mirror. In it, we see people who built their lives around rivers, gods, kings, rituals, and written records. They believed order had a sacred source. They believed cities belonged inside a cosmic structure. They believed kingship could descend from heaven, move across the land, and vanish under waters. Their world was different from ours, yet their fear is familiar. What happens when the systems that protect us stop working? What happens when the river ignores the canal? What happens when the wall becomes mud? What happens when rulers cannot save their own cities? What happens when the future depends on a warning almost no one hears? This is why the flood survivor remains so powerful. Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, each carries a different version of the same unbearable burden. Survival is not simple rescue. It is memory with grief attached. The survivor does not merely escape death. He inherits the duty to carry a destroyed world into whatever comes next. And this may explain why wisdom stands so close to catastrophe in the Sumerian imagination. At the edge of the flood, the tradition does not preserve only terror, it preserves instruction. A father speaks to a son. Advice is handed forward. Proper conduct, caution, humility, restraint, and social order become part of what must pass through the waters. It is as if the old world understood that walls could fall, but wisdom might still cross the boundary. Here lies one of the most surprising revelations. The vanished city's treasure was not gold. It was not a weapon. It was not a hidden machine. It was the belief that human beings must remember how to live together before the waters rise. That does not mean the ancient scribes intended a modern moral lesson exactly as we hear it now. It means their tradition-connected city, kingship, wisdom, warning, and survival in a way that still speaks across thousands of years. A myth can carry meanings its first tellers never fully separated. It can be political, religious, environmental, psychological, and philosophical at once. The greatest danger in reading ancient texts is pretending they are simple. The second greatest danger is pretending they are ours to use however we like. They are neither dead facts nor open fantasies. They are voices from a world that deserves patience. They tell us what ancient people described. They show us what archaeologists can investigate. They invite historians to reconstruct context. They allow modern interpreters to ask careful questions without turning speculation into evidence. And still, after all that care, the mystery remains. Why did the scribes want the city remembered? Perhaps because Shuruppak marked the end of the first royal age. Perhaps because its name was bound to an older flood memory. Perhaps because it belonged to a sacred geography of beginnings. Perhaps because its association with wisdom made it the perfect vessel for warning. Perhaps because a real disaster, or several disasters, had entered cultural memory so deeply that only myth could hold their emotional force. Or perhaps because ancient Mesopotamians understood something that later civilizations often forget. A city can vanish twice. First, when its people leave, die, or are overwhelmed. Second, when its name is no longer spoken. Writing was their defense against the second death. That is what makes the clay tablets so moving. They are small objects carrying immense resistance against water, mud, time, conquest, decay, and forgetting. They preserve names, not perfectly, not completely, often broken, partial, and silent where we most want answers. But enough remains to tell us that someone cared to copy the vanished world. Enough remains for Shuruppak to breathe. The city itself no longer stands as it once did. The streets are gone. The voices are gone. The final day, whether historical disaster, sacred imagination, or layered memory, cannot be replayed. No excavation will recover the exact fear in the eyes of the people who watched water rise across a plain. No tablet will give us every missing line. No modern theory will reduce the flood to one clean explanation, but perhaps the unanswered nature of the story is its final power. The Sumerians were not preserving certainty, they were preserving a question. Where does civilization come from, and what makes it disappear? That question has followed humanity ever since. It appears in abandoned cities, collapsed empires, drowned coastlines, broken languages, burned libraries, and forgotten gods. Every age imagines itself more advanced than the last. Every age believes it can control more, predict more, store more, protect more. Yet beneath every city there is still vulnerability. Mud brick has changed into concrete and steel. Clay tablets have changed into servers and screens. Canals have changed into global systems of power. Food, trade, energy, and information. But the ancient fear remains recognizable. What if the world we build is more fragile than the stories we tell about it? This is why the vanished city before the Great Flood continues to call from the oldest clay. It is not asking us to believe every myth as literal record. It is not asking us to dismiss myth as primitive fiction. It is asking us to stand in the space between evidence and wonder, where human beings first tried to understand why everything they built could be taken away, whether Shuruppak was remembered as a real city transformed by sacred imagination, a symbolic final capital of the pre-flood world, or a vessel for ancient trauma carried through scribal tradition. Its name still performs the same task. It warns against forgetting, and perhaps that is why the ancient scribes pressed the story into clay, not to prove they had solved the mystery of the flood, but to make sure the mystery survived us. Because if a vanished city can still speak after thousands of years, what other warnings are waiting inside the broken names we have not yet learned how to hear?